The name Doheny is pretty well known, especially in California. We have Doheny Street, Doheny State Beach, the Doheny Memorial Library at USC, and a few others. One of the places we're going to talk about today is Doheny Mansion, which is also known as the Greystone Mansion. I had the opportunity to walk around the first floor of the mansion, and it didn't disappoint. There have been many films shot inside the mansion, as well as the land surrounding it. Some of these films include There Will Be Blood, Dr. Dolittle, Death Becomes Her, The Loved One, The Big Lebowski, Batman and Robin, The Witches of Eastwick, and many others. The land now belongs to the city of Beverly Hills and is dedicated for use as a public park. But let's dive into the history of Edward L. Doheny, or more importantly, his son, Edward L. Doheny Jr., who commonly went by the name Ned, for it was Ned who would live in the mansion with his wife and 5 children for only 5 months. At the end of the 5th month, he, along with his secretary, Theodore Hugh Plunkett, would be dead. Doheny Sr., a self-made American oil tycoon, drilled his first successful oil well in California in 1892. From there, he went on to expand his operations, which brought upon the petroleum boom in Southern California. Needless to say, he made a lot of money. In 1893, Doheny's only son Ned was born. He had had a daughter, Eileen, in 1885, but she would pass away at the age of 7 in 1892. She was buried at Evergreen Cemetery in Los Angeles, but would later be disinterred by Doheny and buried with her brother at Forest Lawn Cemetery in Glendale. Mr. Doheny would go on to acquire oil operations in Mexico and South America. His holdings would be called the Pan American Petroleum and Transport Company, which would be one of the largest oil companies in the world in the 1920s. With all this good fortune, it is only natural that some bad would occur in the form of scandal and corruption, making its presence known, in particular with the Teapot Dome scandal. Soon after the turn of the century, U.S. naval ships would start changing from coal-burning ships to petroleum. Now, with World War I on the horizon, there was fear of running out of oil. A decision was made by the Department of the Navy to find oil reserves on public land and set them aside for possible future needs of the Navy. The Teapot Dome in Wyoming was picked by the government because there was an oil field named Salt Creek Oil Field, which was one of the largest oil-producing fields in America. Commercial developers would have to stay clear of it due to it being on federal land. There were also 2 reserves in California as well. Enter Albert Fall. Prior to 1921, Albert Fall was New Mexico's first U.S. Senator. He had been an oil developer and miner in the Southwest. When W.G. Harding was elected as president in November of 1920, with a lot of backing coming from wealthy oil developers, announced that Albert Fall would become the new Secretary of the Interior. Mr. Fall did not have the authority over the Teapot Dome Naval Oil Reserve, nor the 2 oil fields in California, because they were the property of the U.S. Navy. Naval Secretary Edwin Denby was somehow convinced to transfer the authority of the Naval Petroleum Reserves to the Interior Department. This opened up the opportunities of oil developers to bribe Fall, obviously under the table, into giving exclusive access to these oil reserves for drilling and oil exploration, with no official competitive bidding. The lease of the Teapot Dome fields was given to Henry Sinclair, and Edward Doheny was given the lease to the 2 oil fields in California. Other oil developers started to notice Sinclair's trucks and gear on the Teapot Dome land and wondered what was going on. The federal government got word of this, and an investigation began, and the contracts of Sinclair and Doheny were ended. These contracts had been worth over $100 million. Albert Fall would be indicted on accepting bribes. Doheny Sr. and Sinclair were charged with bribing Albert Fall. Doheny Jr. and his chauffeur, Hugh Plunkett, would be indicted on bribery charges as well, due to the fact that it was Doheny Jr. who brought the suitcase filled with the $100,000 bribe to Mr. Fall. Doheny Sr. would eventually be acquitted twice, but Albert Fall would be found guilty of accepting the bribes. Now let's rewind a little bit so we can talk about the heir of the multi-millionaire, Edward Doheny Jr. Doheny Sr. and his wife Carrie would divorce in 1900, and Mr. Doheny would be given custody of little Ned. Some reports said that this had been too much for Carrie, and in September of 1900 she would commit suicide. When I looked into the news clippings regarding her death, I never came across the word suicide being used. Newspapers reported that Mrs. Doheny went to take some medicine and supposedly took the wrong bottle. The mistaken bottle was actually poison, a fluid used for an electric battery. Her staff attempted to save her life, but it was too late. Like her daughter Eileen, she was buried at Evergreen Cemetery in Los Angeles, but would also be disinterred by Doheny Sr. and buried with her 2 children in Forest Lawn Cemetery in Glendale. Ned would be raised by his father and his new wife, Carrie Estelle Doheny, in Los Angeles. Yes, that is correct. Both wives were named Carrie. His early schooling was in a private Catholic school. He would graduate from Los Angeles High School in 1911 and then entered Stanford University. He would remain here for his freshman year. After that, he would go to USC. In 1914, he would marry Lucy Smith of Pasadena. He would graduate from USC with a degree in business in 1916. He would become the first president of the Greater Alumni Association of Southern California in 1923 and 24, and was a member of the Trojan Board of Trustees, and would make an endowment of $200,000 to USC in 1928. To say that he was devoted to his alma mater would be an understatement. Ned was preparing to work alongside his father and would eventually become vice president in Doheny Sr.'s oil company. When the U.S. entered the World War, Doheny would enlist in the Navy. He was commissioned as a senior lieutenant, first serving on the cruiser Huntington, and later in Washington in the office of the Judge Advocate General. He still held a commission with the Navy Reserves at the time of his death. By 1926, Ned and his wife would have 5 children. That same year, Doheny Sr. would give the family a belated wedding gift of land consisting of 12.58 acres. The following year, construction on the Greystone mansion would begin and would continue for 3 years, even though the family would move into the house during the fall of 1928. Besides the beautiful mansion, originally the entire parcel of the land would also consist of kennels, tennis courts, stables, a fire station, gatehouse, waterfalls, a lake, swimming pool, and a greenhouse. Doheny Jr. and his family were living well. Ned would also take over as head of the oil company for his father around this time. After only 5 months of living in the mansion, tragedy would strike. On the night of February 16, 1929, Ned and his secretary Hugh Plunkett would be found dead in one of the guest rooms of the Doheny mansion. Now, before we go through the events that occurred that night, we need to learn a little bit more about one of the victims. Here's some of the information that I was able to come across about Hugh Plunkett. Theodore Hugh Plunkett was about 3 years younger than Ned. There are different reports as to how Plunkett came to be affiliated with the Dohenys. One news item from the Great Fall Tribune in Great Falls, Montana, interviewed a New York lawyer named Frederick R. Kellogg, who said he was friends with both Doheny and Plunkett in school. Mr. Kellogg said, "Hugh Plunkett and Ned were classmates. I knew them both, and they were quiet, even-tempered young fellows who liked each other. Their friendship endured through the years of youth and young manhood, and when Plunkett, several years ago, needed outdoor employment, he was used by the Dohenys on their properties. He acted as secretary to Ned." In another report, Plunkett had actually started working for Doheny Sr. as a secretary and stenographer in the offices of the Mexican Petroleum Company. Plunkett would then become a private secretary for Ned. The Los Angeles Times would say he was first acquainted with the family of E. L. Doheny Sr. while he was employed as a tire changer at the W. H. Smith service station on Pico Street, between Olive Street and Grand. The service station was owned by the father of Lucy Smith, who was to become Mrs. E. L. Doheny Jr. Young Plunkett often repaired tires or motors of Mr. Doheny's machines, as well as for the family of his employer. When his employer's daughter was married to Doheny Jr., Plunkett was hired as chauffeur by the latter. He became more and more in confidence of the younger Doheny, and in later years, almost all of his time was devoted to his affairs. I don't know which of the reports are more factual, so I will just say Plunkett's affiliation with the Doheny family lasted 16 years when he started off as a chauffeur. He would move up the ranks to become the personal secretary for Ned, and would also be considered a trusted friend. In 1928, Plunkett and his wife Harriet, who were married around 1918, would divorce. After his death, Harriet would tell the press that they divorced due to religious disagreements. Harriet had taken interest in the Baha'i cult. She would learn of her ex-husband's death at a temple where she began serving as a neophyte. She left the cult center to travel to Los Angeles, where she would remain until after Plunkett's funeral. Now, when I read the word cult in the article, I wanted to look a little bit more into this so-called cult. I found the website for the Ananda Ashrama, a Lakra Center retreat. In Sanskrit, Ananda means bliss, and Ashrama means spiritual retreat. So, this place is a retreat where one strives to live by and practice spiritual life in order to realize the joy of the divine. Founded in 1923, Ashrama is a non-sectarian place of worship dedicated to all religions of the world, where people of different faiths may come together and worship the one spirit who is called by many names. To get back to Harriet, she would say of both Plunkett and Doheny that they were both highly strung and given to fits of anger. But she would also say to a member of the cult that she never noticed any signs of insanity in her husband, although he was given to fits of anger, which he later regretted. Plunkett would live in an apartment on Cochrane Avenue, but according to news reports, he spent a lot of his time at the mansion, sometimes sleeping in one of the guest rooms. Now, supposedly, starting about a year before the tragedy, Plunkett had begun to crack due to the pressures of his employment with the Dohenys. He became highly nervous. The Doheny family doctor, Dr. E.C. Fishbaugh, would tell police, "I'd been treating him for about a year. He was intensely nervous, and recently an infection on his head added to his irritability. Around Christmas time, he suffered a complete breakdown, and for 3 weeks as a patient in the Doheny home. Since that time," Dr. Fishbaugh would say, "Mr. Plunkett had been very nervous, but not irrational." Now, I would think working for Ned Doheny would be a stressful job. And on top of that, Ned and Plunkett were still in trouble for their participation in the Teapot Dome scandal. I couldn't imagine being put in that position. Now that we have a little background on each of the victims, let's discuss the events that occurred that February day in 1929. There are many different accounts of that day, some from the same person. In Dr. E.C. Fishbaugh's first statement, he would say that he was summoned to the Doheny home before midnight. He found Mrs. Doheny upset. She said Plunkett was acting violent and had apparently gone mad. The two went into Doheny's bedroom. As they neared the door, it burst open and Plunkett lunged out of the room and shouted, "Stay out of here!" Plunkett then slammed the door shut. Before Dr. Fishbaugh could open the door, they heard a shot and then another. The doctor opened the door and found Doheny dead on the floor with a bullet through his temple, Plunkett dead on the floor nearby with a gun beneath his body. Now, in another news item, Mrs. Doheny led the doctor to the guest room and not Doheny's actual bedroom. This guest's bedroom is located on the first floor. Now, in the Evansville Courier and Press in Indiana, the doctor's statement is a bit more detailed. Starting at around 5 o'clock that afternoon, Dr. Fishbaugh was asked to come to the mansion. He and Mr. and Mrs. Doheny had a sit-down with Mr. Plunkett, urging him to go to a hospital or a sanitarium for a complete rest, hoping he would be able to recover from all his nervousness. Mr. Plunkett refused and said, "I'll be all right. I don't need to go to any hospital." At around 7 o'clock, Mr. Doheny called the doctor again, saying, "Doctor, I wish you would come over in case Plunkett comes back again this evening. Won't you please leave word where you'll be so I can call you?" Dr. Fishbaugh was going to the Hollywood Playhouse that night, but he left word with his maid to call the theater box office if he was needed by Doheny. Well, Plunkett did indeed come back to the mansion around 10 o'clock. He was again highly excited and nervous. Mr. Doheny would immediately call the doctor's home. Fishbaugh's maid answered the phone, and the caller said, "Please ask Dr. Fishbaugh to come over at once. It's an emergency case." The maid would call the ticket office. Once receiving the notification, the doctor raced to the Doheny mansion. Mrs. Doheny met him at the door. She would tell him that the children were upstairs, and then she pointed down the hall. At that very moment, Plunkett appeared in the doorway of the bedroom. He told Mrs. Doheny and Dr. Fishbaugh, "Don't you come back here." He turned back to the bedroom and shut the door. Then a gunshot. He rushed to find the bodies of Mr. Doheny and Mr. Plunkett on the floor. Plunkett laid outstretched, face down across the threshold of the bedroom door, his head resting on an arm which lay across the gun. A bullet through his head had instantly killed him. Mr. Doheny was lying on his back, an overturned chair between him and the bed. There was a bullet hole clear through his head from one temple to the other. Mr. Doheny was in his silk nightgown and dressing robe. He must have been ready for bed before Plunkett came back again. Mr. Plunkett was fully dressed. So, they heard a shot, but when they entered the room, there were two bodies. When was the other person shot? Before the doctor arrived, Mrs. Doheny would recall hearing something. According to the Los Angeles Times, she recalled, "I heard a noise, but I thought someone had turned over some furniture or something, and I paid no attention to it." She would also say that she spent some time during that evening in the living room and heard no quarreling between her husband and Mr. Plunkett. To me, this seems like a strange reaction to have. The sound of possible overturned furniture would seem like a possible altercation to me, and I think I would have gone to check to see if everything was okay between the two men. Also, I would tend to think that the sound of furniture falling over would be slightly different than the shot of a gun, but who am I to say? So, we have an idea of what occurred during the day at the mansion and what occurred after 10 o'clock that night, but what happened during the time Plunkett left the mansion and then decided to return to it that evening? I found a statement from Plunkett's servant, Mr. Tony Jacob, that was reported in the San Francisco Examiner. Still being frightened by what occurred that night, Mr. Jacob would only talk to the manager of the apartment house where Plunkett lived. Her name was Mrs. M.E. Carey, and this was the statement she gave. Mr. Jacob came into the apartment that evening to find Mr. Plunkett slamming doors and slamming a spoon against the table. Frozen with fear, he also watched Plunkett throw several kitchen knives into the wall with maniacal strength. From time to time, Plunkett would tell Mr. Jacob to tell Mrs. Carey to come here. Bring her here. Mrs. Carey was always friendly to Mr. Jacobs, and he wanted to keep her safe from Plunkett. Mr. Jacob would excuse himself, pretending to fetch Mrs. Carey, when in all actuality he fled and did not relay the message to Mrs. Carey. Mr. Jacob would return to the apartment the next day and checked with Mrs. Carey to see if she had seen Plunkett that day, and if so, how he was feeling. She informed him that Plunkett was dead. Upon hearing this, Mr. Jacob opened up to Mrs. Carey about Plunkett's strange actions the night before. When looking more into Mr. Jacob, I came across items in the Salt Lake Tribune and The Record, a Los Angeles paper, that Mr. Plunkett had had a roommate by the name of George Riley. George Riley would say about that evening that he had been home with Mr. Plunkett until around 6 or 7 that evening. He asked Plunkett to join him for dinner, but Plunkett declined, saying that he was seeing his employer that evening. Mr. Riley would say that Plunkett seemed nervous, but did not appear unusual. He would also say of Plunkett, he would not intentionally harm anyone. He was never a man to start an argument. His nerves had been shattered, he has been ill, and he had tremendous responsibilities on his mind. He used to lie awake at night thinking of Doheny's interests. I can't imagine him doing harm to anyone. Mrs. Carey would state that Plunkett spent most of his time with his employers and was seldom at the apartment. Sometimes Doheny came to the apartment with him, but they didn't stay long. He was an ideal tenant and never caused trouble. Mrs. Carey would talk about Mr. Jacob's recollections of that night. He must have been completely a nervous wreck. If the boy had told me about seeing him throwing knives, I surely would have called a doctor and been able to help him. It's interesting that when in the company of his roommate, Plunkett seemed his normal nervous self, but possibly when alone with his thoughts, began to react irrationally and violently. Had something else occurred between the time Mr. Riley left and when Mr. Jacob appeared? At first, I thought we may never know, but going through some more newspapers, I found some interesting facts that were gathered by District Attorney Buren Fitz. The Los Angeles Times wrote that during Fitz's investigation, it was disclosed that Mr. and Mrs. Doheny visited Plunkett at his apartment only a few hours before the tragedy to try to induce Plunkett to enter a sanitarium until he was better. This visit occurred after the conference they had with him in the presence of Dr. Fishbaugh. During this conference, it was reported that he partially accepted to take a long rest, but during the visit to the apartment he refused, and there was a heated debate. After they left the apartment, the couple went to a picture show. When they returned home, they learned that Plunkett called demanding to know the meaning of certain assertions his employer was said to have made at the apartment. Mrs. Doheny told him that they were only impulsive remarks, but shortly afterwards, Plunkett entered the Doheny home with his own passkey. I feel like now we have a timeline from the late afternoon conference to Plunkett going back to his apartment, the roommate and the servant seeing and speaking with Plunkett, the Dohenys visiting Plunkett at his apartment, them leaving to go to a movie, returning home and finding an angry Plunkett calling them, to Plunkett using his own key to get into the house, then Plunkett and Doheny speaking with one another in a guest's bedroom. Then Doheny calling Dr. Fishbaugh to come over to the house immediately, Mrs. Doheny hearing the sound of possible furniture being overturned, then the doctor arriving at the mansion where he and Mrs. Doheny see him coming out of the guest room, telling them to go back, shutting the door, and then the shot. The doctor opens the door to find the two men dead on the floor. Now let's dive into the actions that were taken by Dr. Fishbaugh, Mrs. Doheny, and the police investigation. After finding the two bodies, Dr. Fishbaugh would say, "I stepped into the hall where Mrs. Doheny stood, and I told her what I found." She was stunned naturally. Someone, I think it was she, called Mr. Anson Lisk. Mrs. Doheny's brothers Warren and Clark Smith were next to be called, and then finally the Beverly Hills police were notified. Chief of Police Sam Blair would arrive, and then District Attorney Buren Fitz would be summoned to the scene. Fitz brought his chief investigators, Lucien Wheeler, and identification expert Leslie White. Captain William Bright of the Sheriff's Office showed up, and lastly, Edward Doheny Sr. was called and told the horrifying news. For many hours, fingerprint experts and identification men made surveys of every article of furniture and every inch of wall and floor space in the guest's bedroom. Doheny Sr. entered the house. He refused to go upstairs where the other family members were grieving together. "No, I must see Ned," he said, and with his head bowed walked down the hall that leads from the front entrance to the room where his son's body lay. "Yes, it is Ned after all. I hoped against hope there was some mistake," officials said. He sobbed. "My boy," as he knelt next to his son. "Ned, my Ned." He sobbed as he was half carried out of the room and led upstairs to where Mrs. Doheny lay grief-stricken. Buren Fitz would interview everyone who was inside the mansion. The servants could shed no more light on the events that transpired. All they knew were the efforts the Dohenys had gone to help Plunkett. The night watchman said he didn't hear the first shot. There was no way to determine how much time passed between the two shots accurately, but it was possibly only a few minutes. Mrs. Doheny could not remember exactly when she heard the first sound that she thought was fallen furniture. It was probably only a few seconds before the doctor rang the doorbell. At around 4 a.m., B.E. Dayton, manager of the Beverly Hills mortuary, arrived at the mansion, and an hour later both victims were removed and brought to the undertaking parlor. The autopsy was performed by Chief Autopsy Surgeon A.F. Wagner at the coroner's office, disclosed evidence that Plunkett placed the muzzle of the old-fashioned gun he used tightly against his head and pulled the trigger. Powder from the shell was found inside his head. The cavity of the skull further indicated that the gun had been held tight against the side of the skull. The autopsy of Doheny would find that the bullet that killed him had been shot from a distance of 6 feet. It would enter the left temple, passing clear through the head, and lodge in the opposite wall of the room. Although the stomachs of both men had been removed and turned over to chemists for analysis, officials said that this was merely a detail and that the investigation was officially closed. Buren Fitz would go on to say, "This interrogation of numerous witnesses is just an additional check on the evidence gathered last night by the investigators at the Doheny home. So far, there has not been a thing developed in the investigation that detracts from the conclusion reached by the officers last night, that this was a murder-suicide, and Plunkett killed Doheny. There is no doubt in my mind that Plunkett was an ill and very nervous man, and that the Doheny family was doing the best they could to put Plunkett in a hospital for his nervous condition. He was to go to the hospital today." Plunkett's body was removed from the Beverly Hills mortuary and brought to the White Undertaking Parlor at 664 West Washington Street. Doheny's body was then removed and taken to Breesy Brothers at 855 South Figueroa Street. There were, however, several new angles to the deaths that had not been brought out were disclosed. The murder weapon, a .5 Colt single-action revolver, was kept in the gun locker of the Doheny garage, and not in Plunkett's apartment, as what was first believed. Apparently, when Plunkett arrived at the Doheny home that night, his phone call was made from the garage at the gates opening to the house. Mrs. Doheny said, "Please don't come up now," to Plunkett. Not obeying her request, he entered the house with his pass key and went to the guest room. It was there that Mr. Doheny would find Plunkett a short time later when Plunkett summoned him. It seems that Doheny was trying to have Plunkett lay down and rest due to his highly excited and nervous state. Doheny had turned down the covers of one of the twin beds in the room. It was believed that he was unable to calm Plunkett down, and this was becoming a sort of showdown regarding the previous discussions of sanitariums, and that is when Doheny called Dr. Fishbaugh to come over as quickly as possible. On February 19th, Doheny Jr.'s service was held at St. Vincent's Cathedral, which had been erected largely through previous gifts Doheny Sr. made of $2 million. It was conducted by Reverend John Cantwell, the bishop of both the Los Angeles and San Diego dioceses. The funeral service was open to friends of the family, but the burial at Forest Lawn Cemetery in Glendale would be private. Doheny Jr.'s body was buried in a temple that was brought from one of the 7 hills of Rome. It was molded by a 2nd century sculptor as a burial place of Saint Sabina, a Christian martyr. It was brought to America by Doheny Sr. 2 years before to be converted into a private mausoleum. Plunkett's service was very simple, with a service at the White Company mortuary. Some of the attendees that were mentioned were Plunkett's parents, his 2 brothers, Robert and Charles, his sister Isabel, and his ex-wife Harriet. It would be officiated by Reverend George Davidson of St. John's Episcopal Church. All the funeral arrangements were made by Plunkett's brother Charles due to their parents being so grief-stricken. Many floral arrangements had been sent. The Doheny family sent numerous arrangements that bore the cards of Mr. and Mrs. Edward L. Doheny Sr. A truck was needed to carry the arrangements to the burial site, which was barely 100 feet away from Doheny Jr. at Forest Lawn Cemetery in Glendale. Doheny Sr. sent R.M. Sands, his confidential secretary, to represent the family. The brothers of Doheny's widow were pallbearers, along with Plunkett's roommate, George Riley. Doheny would leave an estate of over $14 million, whereas Plunkett's estate was estimated at less than $10,000. Now that we have a lot of the facts regarding the lives, deaths, and investigation into the people involved in this tragedy, we can discuss some of the theories and speculations on who pulled the trigger and why they did so. Some have said that Plunkett killed Doheny over the refusal of a pay raise. Others have said that the 2 men were actually lovers and Plunkett killed Doheny and then himself, fearing their romance would be discovered. Another was that Doheny was not the victim but the killer. Maybe he wanted to keep Plunkett silent regarding the Teapot Dome scandal by placing him in a hospital or sanitarium because the mounting stress of the situation was making Plunkett crack. When he refused to go, there was only one other option to silence him. Others have said that Lucy, Doheny's wife, was the killer, having found out about the affair between the men, or possibly Doheny Sr. killed the men after finding out about the affair. Besides whom the killer was, it was theorized that a cover-up had occurred with the investigation by Doheny Sr. It was said that there were white powder burns found around the hole in Doheny's head. This usually points to suicide, and the gun would have been less than 3 feet away when fired. There was no white powder on Plunkett's wound. Also, an investigator found an open bottle of Jack Daniels on the table, though it was said alcohol was not involved in the murder-suicide. With many infamous cases of scandal and murder, inevitably, there are stories and rumors of paranormal activity. Our channel does have the word hauntings in the title, so I feel obliged to list a few sightings that people have said they have seen while visiting the mansion, both the exteriors and interiors. 2 tourists were enjoying the outdoor beauty of the mansion and asked a worker that they encountered on how to get inside for the mansion tour. The employee said that there were no tours offered for the view of the interiors of the mansion. Surprised, one said that they had seen a man in period clothing staring out one of the windows. They thought he was playing a part on the tour. Others have seen a woman believed to be Lucy Doheny wandering through the rooms of the mansion, leaving the scent of lilacs in her place. A black cloaked figure has been seen peering through the window several feet above standing height, doors opening and closing on their own, and a pool of blood that mysteriously appears and disappears. Gunshots and the voice of a man saying that he has been murdered have been recorded by visitors. Could Plunkett or Doheny still be wandering the halls and rooms, possibly reliving the night in 1929 over and over again? Could Lucy Doheny remain in the mansion, not wanting to let it go? She had continued to live in the mansion after the murder and would remarry. She and her new husband would live there until 1955. During my investigation of the first floor of the mansion, I couldn't help but take pictures of the beautiful light fixtures and woodwork throughout the home. In one picture, I captured a white, misty patch of light. Whether this was a trick of the light or something spookier, it seemed apropos for me to throw it into the mix of sightings. Just one more story that is not about the Doheny mansion, but about Doheny Sr., that fits with this discussion of ghostly footsteps echoing through the halls. In an article from the Los Angeles Times, funny enough a couple of days before Halloween in 1930, the small headline read, "Doheny Ghost Escapes Charge of Burglary, Given Home, Job." Members of the household of E.L. Doheny had been hearing mysterious sounds in the Beverly Hills mansion. Phantom footsteps could be heard for 3 days. They decided to do an investigation of the mansion, only to find not a ghost, but a 22-year-old man named Ernest Perplice, hiding in an obscure part of the building. At dusk, he would remove his shoes and enter the mansion through an open window and remain hidden until midnight. That is when he would raid the pantry and icebox for food. Just before dawn, having eaten and slept in the hiding space, he would leave the mansion, only to return again at dusk and repeat the same routine again. On his last night of sneaking around, a guard was making his rounds and entered the basement. He heard the sound of footsteps and eventually caught up with Mr. Perplice. He then took the young man to the police station and a complaint was taken. Like I said before, the story had nothing to do with the Doheny mansion, but it does have to do with a mansion that was owned by Doheny Sr. Spooky, right? Maybe not so much, but it was worth adding. So there we have it. I have given you all the information that I could patch together from various reports and articles from newspapers of that time. I've collected various theories surrounding the events and people involved that night. Some plausible, some not so much. I think we can all agree, though, this was indeed a tragedy. 2 young men, dead before their time, both leaving families grieving for their loss and would never be the same again. No amount of money and success in life could soothe the pain of losing a child.